so for the thousands in attendance and the millions watching around the world. Recognized and known the world over as the people's champion of the world,
Bastian Hoffman.
I think I never had such an introduction before. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
We put a lot of
Should I
pressure on you
start?
with that intro.
Yeah.
Well,
Putting the bar high.
let's start by just telling us what you're going to show us today. And you've got half an hour about to do whatever you want, but we have some expectations. But let us know. What are we doing?
I want to show you a bit about Rancher because it was a topic already a couple of weeks ago on the show, and I think it was cut short a bit in the end, and there is a bit more things to show. And especially I also want to show a bit about the new stuff that is coming up with Harvester, our new product in terms of HCI and a solution that you can install on your bare metal servers to get virtual machines and how to connect this with Kubernetes. And maybe then also we can talk a bit about more what's maybe coming up on the roadmap in the next months with Rancher and our cloud native ecosystem.
Awesome. Depending on how it goes, I have set up Rancher on my bare metal server behind me, so I need a good excuse to go back to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Follow along. Yeah. All right, Bastian, the floor is yours. So we load in your screen.
Perfect. There it is. What you can see here is a pre-configured Rancher instance that I just booted up a couple days ago or so. It has a couple clusters already prepared so that we don't have to wait for it for 5 minutes to provision clusters later on. One of the clusters is even my Raspberry Pi sitting here in the edge of my office room here, the small one, where I'm running things like Home Assistants on and so on. And for those of you who are not that familiar yet with Rancher, maybe a couple words about what it is and what it is used for. Rancher is a multi-cluster Kubernetes management tool that can be used to manage everything from one Kubernetes cluster to multiple one of them and up to thousands or even tens of thousands of clusters that you can manage with one instance and centrally within one location and one pane of glass. And the whole aim behind this is to make it easy to manage Kubernetes clusters regardless where they're running. That can be clusters that are run on cloud providers, somewhere in a public or private cloud. That can also be clusters that run on-premise, on bare metal servers or on your own virtualization solution. And this could also be clusters that run on edge devices and IoT devices like industry PCs in factories or maybe the small PC systems that they have on wind turbines to manage the wind turbine. Or we also have projects where people are running Kubernetes on trains or in self-driving cars for the entertainment systems or for the driving assistance systems. So really interesting projects. And even there, you can run Kubernetes to manage your software, and you can use Rancher to manage all the different clusters, and that can be quickly become thousands of clusters or even millions of clusters across the world. And of course, you can also do a combination of those. You can have setups and Kubernetes clusters on cloud providers and some in your on-premise data centers and put this all into one management tool. And all the differences between the different infrastructures can be made a lot smaller because you have one management tool to manage all the different distributions, all the different Kubernetes clusters out there. When you start up with Rancher and have it installed somewhere, usually it's very quick. You can, for like a testing environment, just start up a Docker container and then you have a running Rancher instance, or you install it highly available in any kind of other Kubernetes cluster, and then just expose this through a normal Kubernetes ingress. You have the dashboard up and running, and then you can start importing or creating additional Kubernetes clusters from within Rancher. Rancher can manage everything that is CNCF certified and behaves like any other Kubernetes. So it could also be a Tanzu cluster, an OpenShift cluster, a cluster that you set up with kubeadm, or an AKS, EKS cluster, everything that speaks Kubernetes. And if it already exists, you can just import it. And then Rancher will generate you a small manifest that deploys an agent inside of your cluster, which connects back to Rancher. And then you can manage the whole cluster there. And if you want to get rid of Rancher again, you can also just delete the agent out of your cluster, and you have your standard vanilla Kubernetes cluster. If you don't have a Kubernetes cluster yet, it gets more interesting because you also can create new clusters. And for that, you have different options. You can create new clusters directly on infrastructure and cloud providers. And you can see I activated a lot of different cloud provider plugins here already. Also things like Equinix or Open Telecom Cloud, but also, of course, all the big ones are in there as well. And if you want to do that, you give Rancher access to the cloud provider or to your virtualization solution. And Rancher then can provision virtual machines at this cloud provider, depending on the configuration you can put in here, and then install Kubernetes on it. Or directly go to a cloud provider and use one of the managed Kubernetes options. If you don't have a cloud provider and maybe you have some bare metal servers, it's also definitely possible to just say, hey, I want to create a Kubernetes cluster, and then you get an installation script generated from Rancher that you just install, run on any kind of Linux, and also create it into a Kubernetes node. And just to quickly show this, how this can look at a cloud provider, I prepared this at DigitalOcean here. I already gave Rancher access to DigitalOcean. And now, there it loaded all the information. So I put my cloud credentials with my DigitalOcean API key in here already. And then I can give the cluster a name. I can choose how many virtual machines I want to have inside of the cluster. So let's say 3. I can choose which roles these virtual machines should have in the cluster, if there should be an etcd, control plane, or worker node. And then I can choose how the virtual machines should be configured, in which data center and region I want to run them, with which size, with which operating system. This is, of course, different between all the different cloud providers and infrastructure providers because they have different options. But what is offered there, I can also configure and choose here. What is the same for every infrastructure provider and every one of these configuration options is that you can configure the Kubernetes cluster itself. I can choose the version, the CNI plugin for setting up the network. I can configure a cloud provider integration so that I can get directly load balancers and persistent volumes from the cloud provider. And then I can configure everything around networking, etcd, backup, schedules, upgrade strategies directly from here. And when I click create, the virtual machines get created and the cluster gets created, and in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, I should have a cluster up and running. What is then very interesting, and also one of the big reasons why organizations worldwide use Rancher, is that you not only have the visibility inside of the clusters and you can provision and manage these clusters, you can also provision and manage which users and groups in your organization can have access to your clusters in a central way. Access control in Kubernetes is oftentimes a bit, like at least in standard vanilla Kubernetes, is a bit not the nicest thing. You can use OpenID, but it's hard to set up, and you can't really use your Active Directory or LDAP directly, so it's really complicated, and we try to make this easier. Globally within Rancher, you can set up and configure the authentication provider of your choice, and we support a huge variety of them. And once you did this, you have all your users and groups from this authentication provider available. And then centrally within Rancher, you can configure with also a role-based access control system what permissions should have these users or groups have within Rancher. For example, should they be able to create new clusters or not? And you can also centrally configure which permissions should every user or every group have in which cluster. So you can say you have 10 clusters and maybe 5 development clusters, 5 production clusters. And on the production clusters, all the developers of the organization only have read access, but on the dev clusters, they have full access and can do everything. And you can not only do this on a per cluster level, but of course also on a per namespace level to even segment a cluster into different segments and give different permissions depending on the namespace where your applications and pods and containers and resources are. And a lot of these roles are already built in, but you even can create your own role configurations to go down onto the Kubernetes API resource level and create then the role configuration you need if you need more granular permissions than what is offered out of the box. Inside of the cluster, in the end, it's standard Kubernetes role-based access control. So it's nothing Rancher specific. The great thing, though, is that you can configure this all centrally, and you don't have to click within like 50 clusters and create 100 different cluster role bindings and cluster roles and everything. Goes maybe back also to the tool you showed earlier, where it was syncing cluster roles and cluster role bindings through different namespaces. I can even see kind of a use case for that, because you don't want to replicate all these resources in 50 different namespaces. That could make it easier. But here, Rancher would tell you do this for you. You just configure this once centrally, and Rancher rolls this out and keeps it up to date to all clusters. And it also not only rolls it out, you also have central visibility and central auditing mechanisms. So I can click on a user, I can see which permissions I have globally, which permissions I have in each cluster and in each project and namespace in each cluster. And of course, if I switch on audit logging, also the same user information from my Active Directory is also passed down to the logs, which is also a very nice thing. And it may look like not much, but this is especially if you run Kubernetes in enterprises, that can be a huge game changer, especially also if you run it on premise or in a hybrid environment.
Yeah, and real quick, the nice thing too is it says user, your default admin. If I was a user, like a dev user, and I can be set up access to the dashboard, and I would only see my resources that I'm allocated in the dashboard, correct? Yeah, which is awesome. Obviously, as a default admin, when you start running hundreds of clusters, it's gonna be great. But then you get to kind of just show what people are, the information that they need in their day-to-day, right?
Definitely. And also we have large customers. I think we can talk about like Ubisoft, for example, the gaming provider is a very large customer of ours, and they're running, I think, already hundreds or even thousands of clusters within one Rancher management server. So having role-based access control is also very important, but also having a central pane of glass where you see everything can help a lot to make sense of all these clusters here. But you not only can configure access control, you have also a nice dashboard to see what is happening inside of your cluster. And for that, I already prepared this demo cluster so that we don't have to wait the 1-2 more minutes for the DigitalOcean cluster to come up. So if I click on one of these clusters, I get a nice dashboard that gives me an overview what is happening inside of my cluster. Like basic information, how many resources I have in there, how many nodes, what is the capacity. I also directly, if I have the monitoring activated within Rancher for this cluster, I get firing alerts. So I broke a couple of things in my cluster there so that we can see some alerts in here. I directly have access to the basic metrics of the cluster, how my cluster is doing, how my workloads are doing, how my nodes are doing. And I can, if I don't want to use the Kubernetes API, directly start interacting with my Kubernetes clusters through a nice web UI. So I don't have, especially as a developer, if I quickly want to boot up a container, I don't have to learn Kubernetes YAML. I also can directly say, hey, I want to create an Nginx image somewhere in my cluster. I can maybe configure pull secrets if it's coming from a private registry. Pull secrets would also be one of the few use cases where I think it could be beneficial to have this secret sync mechanism if you don't want to configure the secrets directly at containerd level also. You can create then open up ports, directly create services from here. You have all the capabilities that Kubernetes has. Of course, the whole Kubernetes YAML is not hidden. You can still see this. You can still edit this YAML if you want to. And of course, you can also still use your kubectl, your CI/CD tools. Like all of this is not hidden. The UI is just an additional possibility that you have to interact with your Kubernetes cluster. Usually, privately, when I'm deploying something, I'm much rather using automation and CI/CD pipelines. But I found that such an UI is especially beneficial if I want to quickly debug something, because when something is wrong and I want to quickly go to the logs, it can be much easier to say, okay, let's look at all the pods. Oh, I have quite a few in there, so let's filter maybe for, let's say, the Harbor pods I have in here for my container registry, and then I can quickly look in here, have a look at the logs, and have the logs. Okay, this one doesn't seem to have any logs. Yay. Great. It's not
Every
logging
demo
much.
is cursed.
Yeah. Okay.
That comes
But
on
I
the show,
can
so you're
I
fine.
can look at the logs directly here, directly from the UI. Here. Okay, I found a container that actually logs something. And then I can switch between different logs here, aggregate them together very easily. If I wanted to, I can also open up a shell inside of the container directly from the UI. I can do all of that with kubectl. It just gets a lot easier when you click around there. And of course, also, since I have a UI where I can click around, a lot of the resources that are in the cluster are directly linked together. So if I have an ingress here, I directly have a link also to the service that is targeted by the ingress. I can click on it. I get to the service detail page. I directly see which pods are behind the service and what is their state. That also makes clicking around a lot easier instead of copy and pasting these pod and service names. So that is in there.
Everything as well can be downloaded as a YAML even after configuration too, right?
Sure.
Which to me I think is awesome. If you're like in operations and you have 5 different teams, you can set them all into Rancher, like view what's going on between the teams and try to get maybe a semblance of like a greater policy, let's say, that you want to push down because you have the visualization of all that, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's like the YAML is also there. It's in the end a client for the Kubernetes API. It's not adding anything on top of the Kubernetes API. Everything is in Kubernetes. And I also have access to all the custom resources. If I'm using operators, for example, they are also all there here. So for example, I'm using Cert Manager to manage Let's Encrypt certificates. So all the Cert Manager resources are also in here. I can access them as well. And if I want to use kubectl or my IDEs, I can also generate myself a kubeconfig, and the token authentication token in here is then tied to my user in my Active Directory, for example. And it doesn't matter if I use the clusters through the UI or through kubectl. I only have the permissions that I should have depending on the configuration that the admin did.
Yeah, so no developer has to ping the admin for a kube config certificate or anything crazy like that.
No, they can just go. Everyone can generate themselves. And of course, if the user is offboarded, then the token that is inside of there is also not valid anymore. So also important because people may leave the company at some point.
Yeah, perfect.
Whereas if I have a client certificate authentication at Kubernetes, that one is, I probably have to recreate all the client certificates then. It is a lot harder.
From an operational standpoint, it's just a huge time saver, right?
Yeah.
And actually from a security standpoint, it's great.
Definitely. There are a couple other nice things in here. I also have a direct integration of an application marketplace. This is in the end a front end for Helm. I can add my Helm repositories also here in the UI. And then if I wanted to install an application, I can just click on it. Let's see which one. Let's maybe, if I wanted to install Artifactory, I can click on it and then go through the steps to install the Helm chart directly through a nice intuitive UI instead of having to do everything on the command line. On the other hand, if I use the command line, I also see all the installed applications in here as well. So it is, again, a direct connection to what Helm is doing. And maybe as a last thing on top of that, what can be also really a time saver, especially for operations, especially if you're using not only one cluster, but multiple of them. Let's say development, staging, production, maybe multiple development clusters, maybe multiple clusters on different infrastructures, maybe one for machine learning or so. Rancher also includes global continuous delivery system that I can use to roll out applications and manifest Helm charts to all my clusters or to some of my clusters in a GitOps way. So centrally within Rancher, I have access to all my clusters. Here are all the 3 ones that I have at the moment. If I wanted to, I can group the clusters together. So I could say I have one group of dev clusters where all my dev clusters are in, and I can create as many groups as I want. And then I can register Git repositories inside of Rancher directly. And I have prepared one here. This one contains a Hello World application with the deployment and the service. So nothing very special. And if I put in the URL here, I could set up authentication. I could set up TLS settings if that were an internal Git repository like GitLab that doesn't have a public CA certificate. I can watch the whole repository or maybe only one or multiple subdirectories. And then I can decide to which clusters or cluster groups the content of this repository is deployed to. So let's maybe take the demo cluster here to just pick one. And then if I click create, Rancher will now start watching the Git repository for changes. And every time something changes in the Git repository, the content of the repository is then also deployed to all attached clusters. And as soon as something changes, if I were to change here something in the deployment YAML, it will also be deployed in here. So very useful, for example, if you have 10 clusters and you want to deploy some security daemons or some policies to all the clusters and keep that in sync. And of course, it not only supports plain Kubernetes manifests, you can also put Helm charts in there. You can reference other Helm charts. It supports customize, and I can even make customizations depending on the clusters or cluster groups, so that I can say, okay, 90% of my manifest or my Helm chart is the same, but a couple values are different cluster by cluster. I can also put in the configurations in there. So that can also be a huge time saver when operating clusters on scale. Yeah, and maybe as a last point, I heard maybe you have a question for that.
Sorry. No, I was just gonna say that that's awesome. I didn't actually know that. Is this the CD aspect new as a part of 2.6?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
It was there already in 2.5, but it was a bit hidden in 2.5, and it was developed a lot further and has a lot more features now in 2.6.
Nice. Yeah, I missed this. This is awesome.
Yeah, we did I was gonna say we did it on the show. We did Weave and we did Argo. So this is great. We've got collect them all. And it's about really like the groups. I don't know that I saw that in other platforms.
Argo is also nice, and actually, in a lot of things in Rancher, we try to not reinvent the wheel. For example, for monitoring, we're using Prometheus and Grafana. For log shipping, we are using an operator from Banzai and bundling that and working with them together. So it's, if possible, we are actually trying to put the industry standards in there that everyone is using to make the life easier. And when looking at CD, like a year and a half ago, we also, for example, looked at Argo or Flux to see if that would work for our use cases. But what we want to enable is to have CD on scale so that it also works with thousands of clusters. And then it gets a bit more complicated, and Argo didn't scale that well, which is also fine. It's not their use case, right? And Argo then has other features that also make it very nice. So it depends what you need to do and what you want to do, and then one tool is better than the other or not. So definitely something to try out if you're using Rancher already. And also, one thing, Rancher, the system is also oftentimes tries to eat their own dog food, or Rancher tries to eat its own dog food. So this continuous delivery tool is also used internally in Rancher to, for example, keep cluster role bindings and stuff like that in sync on scale. So it is very tied into how Rancher and the whole cluster provisioning works.
Awesome.
Yeah, and maybe one completely new thing that just was released a couple of weeks ago is the integration with our new project Harvester. And Harvester is an HCI tool, so hyper-converged infrastructure that you can run on bare metal servers in an appliance mode. And it gives you the possibility to create virtual machines on a set of servers. To also easily migrate virtual machines from one server to another. And it also gives you distributed storage and networking and load balancing on top of that. And the interesting thing is, first of all, it's completely open source. And it ties in very well with Rancher and makes it very easy then to create Kubernetes clusters on top of them. So here we can see the Harvester UI. You can see I have 3 servers here that are running Harvester with quite a few resources. You can also see there are a couple virtual machines already running here, and people are currently playing around with this, other colleagues. And of course, I can create new virtual machines in here. So I could say I want to have virtual machine for workload that is not containerized yet, that is running on VMs. for example, like a MySQL database, and configure how many CPUs, how much memory I want to give the VM. I can add my SSH keys directly to here. I can configure volumes and disks. I can choose which operating system I want to run on here. I can configure the networking and add one or multiple networks to my virtual machine. So it supports VLANs and everything. And of course, I also can configure Cloud Init to install all the packages that I need when booting up in VM. And yeah, that's quite simple and easy. And now my VM gets started. That's one thing. Of course, it also supports backups for all the VMs. And yeah, I can then, when the VM is started, also migrate it to another node, restart it, pause it, and create templates from it, and so on directly from here. But even more interesting, if we go back to Rancher, I connected now Rancher to this Harvester cluster. And if I create a new cluster from within here, let's take the RK2 one. I can have also Harvester as an infrastructure provider. I can choose now which Harvester I want to use. So I can also connect multiple Harvester instances to one Rancher management server, and can again give the cluster a demo name and configure the VMs that should be created for this cluster. So very similar to earlier, I can choose the image. Let's take maybe an Ubuntu here. I can choose the network where the VMs should be created in. I can configure then the SSH user for my image. Configure CPU, memory, disk space, and I can configure the Kubernetes settings in here. And then click Create, and it directly integrates and will boot up now in a couple of minutes VMs inside Harvester here. There it's coming, the first one.
I know what I'm doing the rest of the afternoon.
Yeah. And the good thing is Harvester is, like, the idea is it's an appliance. Like you get if you go to the homepage, you get an ISO, you download it, and you boot up your VM with the ISO, you get an installation wizard, and then a couple minutes later, you have it all running. So you have Harvester running, you have Longhorn as a distributed storage running under this, and then you can start using it. So it's like an all-in-one package.
Yeah, and that storage driver is part of Kubernetes is massive as well. I know that really that hasn't completely been solved in the industry. There's a bunch of software vying for it, but yeah, the Longhorn, that's huge. You get storage that just gets brought up with your cluster, which is great.
Yeah, and it's automatically also connected. So if I would, this is a cluster I prepared already. This is also running on this Harvester instance. And if I create now a workload here, let's say again an Nginx with an Nginx image, and if I now create here a load balancer service for port 80, and if I also add some storage to this deployment, I can choose Harvester as a storage class. This is automatically created inside of the cluster. And I could say I want to have a 1 GB volume here. And let's mount this just at /data. Doesn't matter too much. And if I create this, this comes out of the box as soon as I create the cluster. I don't have to set up anything additionally. And somewhere here, my Nginx is starting up. And then I automatically also get a persistent volume claim for this Nginx. And this is a volume that is then created directly in Harvester as a volume. Somewhere here should be now, I think it's, this one here, 31 seconds ago. So this is my persistent volume directly here. And I also got a load balancer service created. And let's also look for it. Here, load balancer service, and this load balancer service should also, has a public VIP. Of course, this is it's not a public IP address; it's a private IP address because the network is not exposed externally. We didn't attach any public IP addresses to it, but it's used a private IP range for VIPs. And under this is actually using KubeVIP, so it's also, again, not completely invented, but directly packaged with Harvester, and I have integrated directly in there, which is also quite nice.
Yeah. Just the workflow seems very refined. It's very cool.
Intuitive.
Yeah. And honestly, it's just for my own use case at home. This is perfect. Because having something that's remote, that's easy to manage, and you just go and create a Docker container, right, that runs Rancher on your local workstation. That's great.
Yep.
Are all these features available just with the Rancher version that you can go and pull from the website?
Yep, that's the newest Rancher version 263. This is the whole Harvester integration. It's there just on the website. You can install it.
And then we'll send everybody your way when they run into issues.
Sure. No.
Very cool. Steve,
I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. What do you?
That was probably the clearest, most successful demo we've ever done on the show.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so much functionality just in so little time. That was really impressive. And I'm feeling very similar to Foster in that I am doing too many things manually that I could just do the super easy way. Maybe I love punishment. I love YAML. That's my problem.
One of the things that changed in 2.6 was, I think it was the apps and marketplace. The marketplace in the old Rancher was massive, right? And I think there's been trimmed down a little bit.
Yeah.
Was there a specific reason for it? Was there I know you said that you wanted to get more up to industry standard. Was there sort of a concerted effort in the marketplace to say, hey, here are the apps that we want to make sure have
so the main reason is the old apps marketplace. There was just tons of stuff in there that wasn't maintained, that some people at some point submitted. I think there was a WordPress Helm chart in there that didn't get an update for 3 years or so, and that's not good, right? And I think it's not even one of our engineers that submitted it. It was just someone from the community, and then in the early days, someone said, "Oh, that's a good idea to have a WordPress in there. Let's merge it," and then nobody maintained it. So that's why we trimmed it down. We are using now the app marketplace, the stuff that it directly ships with, the repository that are in here out of the box. There are 2 of them. One is our own, and we use this to allow you to add additional functionality to each cluster. If you create a cluster, for example, the whole monitoring integration with the alerts that you saw earlier, it's not there. It's not on by default, but you can install the monitoring app to add this functionality to Rancher. Reason for that is maybe you don't want to use Prometheus and Grafana. You pay Datadog big money. Why would you then run Prometheus in addition in your cluster? You want to deploy the Datadog agent inside of your cluster, and that's it. And in addition, the orange ones here, these are applications that are provided by partners, and that they're then also really vetted that they are maintaining this. And one of them is, for example, the Datadog agent, where Datadog says, hey, we want to make it easy for Rancher users to add Datadog to their clusters. So if they want to deploy the Datadog agent, they click install, they click next, they put in the Datadog API key and maybe a couple more things, click install, and then they have it running. And we work together with all these partners to ensure this is working great together. But of course, you can add your own additional repositories too here. So if I have additional Helm repositories that I want to add to the application marketplace, I can add a repository. I can add the URL in here and maybe set up authentication if it's a private repository, and then I can also install all the applications directly from here as well.
Very cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. Is NeuVector going to make it into the apps and marketplace anytime soon? That was some big news you guys broke at the end of the year.
See
right?
I also see a tab up there. Hey, wow, there it is.
So it is already in the marketplace. I anticipated the question, so I already opened it. So it's already installable, and the engineering teams are currently working on making the integration nicer. So NeuVector will still remain its own product, similar to Longhorn. It's its own product. You can use it without Rancher. Also Harvester, you can use it without Rancher. But we want to make a very nice integration that you have it very easily installed and have additional benefits like integrations directly in the UI and so that to make it easier to use.
Those integrations into the CI/CD aspect would be pretty cool too, right?
Yeah. Also the whole multi-cluster aspect, because maybe you have a development cluster, you already have all your firewall rules and that you set up in NeuVector to limit what a container can do, which processes you can run, which other services they can communicate to. You have it already defined, all the policies in dev, so you also want to put them into production. And you don't want to recreate them. And since you have all the information already within Rancher, it makes it a no-brainer. It makes it basically a no-brainer. You really want to have this. You want to have this connected.
Yeah, and you could, if like let's say you have all your policies in your development group, if you created a new group that just overlapped with other clusters, or other clusters didn't have the agent installed, you brought them in, those policies would just automatically transfer over to the other cluster, right?
Yep, definitely.
It's awesome.
And also, I think we announced it directly when we also announced the acquisition. NeuVector also will become open source in the near future.
Wow, cool.
Very cool.
Since we're SUSE has been doing open source for nearly 30 years now. Everything that SUSE is doing is open source. Everything that Rancher has been doing for the last 6 years or 7 years has been open source. So NeuVector also will become open source.
So you're coming back to demo NeuVector when it is open source?
We'll be happy to.
All right. Yeah, I'd love to see that.
Awesome.
That'd be great.
Yeah, same.
Any last questions, Steve?
No, I'm pretty impressed with that. That was pretty awesome. Thank you, Bastian. That was great. Foster, you're the Rancher guy.
No, I answered everything. Now I just got to go play with all the things I've been missing. I didn't realize all this functionality. So yeah, that was great, and did it in more succinct than we ever do it too, Steve. So
that was without question. That was going to happen.